Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and thank you for all of you new people coming in and tuning in. And if you've been tuning in from the beginning, thank you so much. First of all, I want to say I am so sorry it's taken like 3 weeks to post this episode. But if you have kids in school right now, you probably know what I'm talking about. Like, the end of the school year is chaos. So we've had a lot going on. On top of that, I am in my 3rd trimester. So like I've mentioned before, this pregnancy is just kicking my butt. So I've been getting pretty sick. So it's kind of hard to get up and do research and do all the things. But I really want to make sure I'm getting these episodes out to you guys as fast as possible. So sorry about the delay on this one. It's been nuts, but I will keep posting. Just make sure you have subscribed to the channel and hit the notification button, or just make sure your notifications are on no matter what platform you're listening on, so you can hear when the new episode's released. I'm trying to get them for sure every other week, but obviously my plan is not working out, so I appreciate you guys. Make sure you're liking and sharing this with people that you think would enjoy these kinds of stories. It's more fun the more we can share this information with people, so we can talk about it with each other and, have our own theories. So make sure you're sharing this with anyone you think would enjoy history or true crime or any of those things. And anyways, I want to give a shout out because I always ask you guys for requests, and I want you to send me whoever you want to hear about, because I love researching people you want to know about. So our shout out goes today to Stacy. Thank you so much for the suggestion for today's episode. It was a fantastic recommendation, and I have a couple other recommendations lined up for a little bit later. So keep those coming in. You can message me either on this episode or go to my Instagram or Facebook account. I will get your message. And I promise you, I will do an episode on that person. So please send in your suggestions. Now today, thanks for Stacy's suggestion. We are going to cover a case that is pretty disturbing and kind of bizarre. Our horrible human in history today wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in the alleys or a criminal mastermind operating behind the scenes. Oh, no. Today's subject was a smiling, pie-making grandmother who giggled her way through multiple murder confessions. That's right, we are going to be talking about none other than Nannie Doss. She's better known as the Giggling Granny. How creepy is that nickname? The Giggling Granny. Seriously, by far the creepiest nickname we've heard. So, Nannie Doss may have looked like a sweet grandmother, but behind her wide smile was a woman responsible for the deaths of at least 11 people. From husbands to family members, no one was safe from this woman. Nannie decided if they were in her way of her dreams, they had to go. So, let's jump in to her twisted tale, Miss Giggling Granny herself, Nannie Doss. Nannie Doss, or should I say Nancy Hazel, was born on November 4th, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama. Her life started off rough and never really smoothed out. So she was one of 5 children born to James and Lou Hazel. They had 4 girls and a boy. Nannie Doss's parents, James and Lou, were pretty poor. They were rural farmers in Alabama, and they lived in a very small conservative community in the early 1900s. While we don't really have extensive records about them, what we know actually paints a pretty grim picture of Nanny's upbringing, particularly her relationship with her father. So James Hazel was known to be a very strict and controlling parent, especially with his daughters. He really believed in hard work and strict discipline, which extended into literally every aspect of the family's life. He did not allow his daughters to wear makeup, to go to social events like dances. They weren't even allowed to date. So he really had the reins tight on his daughter or daughters, all of his daughters. But why was he so strict with just his daughters? He was actually pretty afraid of them becoming promiscuous. So he really limited their social interaction because he didn't want them to be turned into these promiscuous women by associating with other people. For some reason, that makes sense to him. But he often would pull the kids from school because he prioritized farm work over education. And they would spend most of the harvesting and planting season at home working the farm. And as a result, Nanny had a very limited education, which really impacted her literacy and contributed to a lack of formal development in her brain. So there's no official documentation of any kind of physical abuse. Some accounts suggest that her father may have been both emotionally and physically abusive, which the emotional abuse seems pretty obvious since he isolated all of his daughters and he was very domineering. But this had a severe impact and lasting psychological impression on Nanny and her siblings, which you will see later. And her mother, I'm sure you're wondering, well, where was her mother during this whole time? Like, why did her father get away with all of this? Well, her mother, by most accounts, was a very quiet and passive woman who basically went along with anything that her husband wanted and didn't intervene much in all of his harsh treatment of the children. So she just basically was there to support her husband, and that was it. The Hazel home was, like I said, pretty oppressive and joyless, and was dominated by that father, and the mother offered very little support to the children. So to cope, this is a very important thing I am about to tell you. To cope with their father's restrictions, Nanny and her sisters clung to romance fiction and Lonely Hearts columns. So they were dreaming of a life outside of their oppressive home. And to fuel those dreams, they read a lot of romance novels, which is so interesting that her father would shield her from actual social interaction, but allow her to read romance novels. I thought that was a very weird choice. So anyways, they use the books and the Lonely Hearts columns, which we've talked about before. You know, I feel like these Lonely Hearts columns are a death trap. So anyways, they used it to escape the isolation and dreariness of their farm life. And this would actually cause Nanny to develop a very unrealistic fantasy, is the best way to put it, of what true love and romance really was like, because she never experienced it for herself. She just had this fiction. So she really built up this idea of what romance was supposed to be and what it looked like. That is very important, and you'll see why in just a minute. So at age 7, this is also another important thing that happened. Nanny was on a train ride that would change her future. She was riding on a train with her family. Accounts vary as to whether it was a family visit or they were relocating somewhere. But during the ride, the train came to a very sudden and abrupt stop, causing Nanny to slam into the pole, this metal bar in front of her, and she hit her head really hard on the seat in front of her. She was actually unconscious for a short period of time and then experienced noticeable pain and confusion after the fact. So it sounds like she probably got a pretty severe concussion from hitting her head, but just based off of the symptoms that she's exhibiting. It could have been a traumatic brain injury. To me, it sounds more of like a concussion kind of situation. This is something we'll talk about a little later, but according to Nanny later in life, and even some families' accounts of her life, long after this injury, she suffered from severe chronic headaches. She would have blackouts or fainting spells. She would have mood swings and erratic behavior and periods of depression and disassociation. So it seems like it had a longer term effect, but this is what I was saying. We were talking about this a little later. She might have been exaggerating them. We don't know for sure, but they think that this head injury could have potentially made it harder to control impulsivity and emotional instability and had some distorted thinking. So they think this head injury could have had a long-lasting effect and probably had an impact on later decisions in life. I'm a little bit iffy on it because it sounds like she could have exaggerated these injuries to make it seem like, oh, it wasn't my fault because my brain was broken. I don't know for sure, but if she actually suffered a traumatic brain injury, a TBI, to the frontal lobe, it could cause issues with impulse control and emotional regulation, as well as moral reasoning. So it could make sense that her decisions were in fact impacted by this, but we have no way to know because there's no doctor's note, no evidence that it was a traumatic brain injury. But we have mentioned traumatic brain injuries before in some of our serial killer cases. So who knows? It could be a real thing. But anyways, later in life, traumatic brain injuries can also cause emotional detachment from death, which would make sense, callous manipulation, which she got really good at, and lack of remorse, which she never showed for all of her victims. So it's very possible, but again, she could have really exaggerated the severity of these injuries later in life just to justify what she did. Because, if you can lie about killing people, why wouldn't you be able to lie about a brain injury? But we won't know for sure. So anyways, back to Nanny. So she had this head injury when she was little. And then when she was a teenager, that's when she found the romance magazines, the romance novels, the Lonely Heart columns. So that's when she started having this shift of dreaming about this fantasy romantic life that was in her future. And, it sounds about right that the teenage years would be when you start fantasizing about things. Girls tend to be a bit boy crazy when they're teenagers. I would know. I was a teen girl at one point in time. If you can believe that, I know it's hard to believe. But she really idolized these tales of love and passion and the happily ever afters because it was such a sharp contrast to her real life. She really dreamed of being swept off her feet by some handsome stranger. But instead, she found Charlie Braggs, which she thought at first was her happily ever after, right? So in 1921, Nanny was 16 years old. She was working in a line factory in Anniston, Alabama. That's where she met Charlie Braggs. She was co-workers with him, and he was the only son of a single domineering mother. Yeah, I don't know if you can see where this is going to go, but after just a few months, I want to emphasize that, few short months of dating, which to me is already a huge red flag, but these were different times. They got married. So they were married after dating for a few short months at 16 years old. James, so Nanny's father, actually approved of this match, shockingly. It was probably because Charlie came with a very protective mother who would continue controlling Nanny's life. And, with her being married, the threat of promiscuity was way lower, right? So he did support the marriage. But once they were married, she had this dream of our life's going to be so romantic. Everything's going to be so great. Well, once she moved into the Braggs household, her vision of that life fell apart pretty quickly because instead of enjoying independence and freedom and romance, she found herself under the thumb of yet another controlling parent, and that was Charlie's mother. So the three of them lived in very tight quarters. Charlie's overbearing mother quickly made life pretty miserable for Nanny. She criticized Nanny constantly, hovered over the marriage, and allegedly sabotaged their relationship at every turn that she could, which I know you're going to be shocked to hear this, but because they lived in such tight quarters, Charlie's mother never left them alone. She even slept in the same room with them at times. Can you imagine? Now, I've heard a lot of horror stories of mother-in-laws being domineering, trying to break up the relationship, and just mother-in-law just being a terrible human. And if you have a mother-in-law like that and you're listening, I am so sorry. My mother-in-law is amazing, so I can't relate. But if this was happening, it would be really hard to build a strong relationship with your spouse, having such a domineering mother. But just imagine that woman also sharing your bedroom with you. Literally sleeping in the same room. How can you be a married couple, if you know what I mean, with your mother-in-law in the same room? That's horrifying. So Nanny wasn't allowed to socialize, make friends, or assert herself, just like in her childhood with her father's rules. So she was trapped again. This time it's just her mother-in-law controlling her life and her love life, which was her only dream, is to have a nice love life. So even though her mother-in-law was sleeping in the same room as them, they were actually able to have 4 daughters between 1923 and 1927. Now, in 1927, 2 of the children died suddenly. They supposedly died of food poisoning. Now, they have never ruled these 2 children's death as poisoning or murder or anything like that. They literally ruled it as food poisoning. But Nanny had just served them a meal and they died shortly after, which is a pattern that you're going to see repeated over and over. And like I said, the cause of death was never confirmed because they didn't do an autopsy, which obviously is common around that time. It's more likely at that time that you would die of food poisoning. They didn't have a lot of food handlers' permits or, training on how to keep things sanitary and safe. But her husband, Charlie, actually became pretty suspicious of his wife. It seemed really odd to him that 2 of his children, 2 out of the 4, would die so suddenly. And convinced that something was deeply wrong and possibly fearing for his own life, Charlie actually took their eldest daughter, Melvina, and fled, leaving Nanny with their youngest child, Maureen, who was a baby at this time. So I was very confused about this moment in the story because he left his youngest daughter, the baby, with a woman he suspected of killing his other kids and potentially threatening his own life. What the heck? Like, why didn't he take the baby too? I was so confused when I read that part of the story. Why wouldn't he take the baby? A great question. Anyways, he took the oldest. Maybe she was the favorite. I don't know. And the couple officially divorced in 1928. And Charlie, her husband, reported later, he said, "I was afraid of her. She was not right." And yet he left his baby with her? That still irks me a little bit. You can tell I'm a little bitter that he left that child there. Now, Nanny told investigators later that Charlie had been an alcoholic who had abused her and that his mother's interference ruined their marriage. And she totally painted herself as a victim, which, common for these people. And she said she was a victim of domestic and emotional abuse. Sure, Nanny. Sure, if you say so. I mean, she probably did have a point about her mother-in-law sabotaging their marriage. And it is possible that Charlie drank or was unkind. However, most evidence suggests he left because he feared Nanny was killing people. So, rightly so. There isn't a whole lot of proof that he was an abusive spouse. So, she could have just been making that up. So, again, telling lies about things, shocker. Now, although Nanny was never charged with any murders during her time with Charlie, many believe her first victims were those two children. Those were her first tests, and it established her preferred method of killing, which was poisoning. She would put poison in the food, and it's believed that the children had eaten food she had prepared that had poison in it. And later in life, she confessed to multiple poisoning with arsenic or rat poisoning. So it is highly likely that the death of her own children was caused by poisoning. So by 1929, she actually remarried. After divorcing Charlie, Nanny turned to her favorite form of escape again, obviously the romance novels and the Lonely Hearts columns in newspapers. And she met Robert Franklin Harrelson. They started writing letters back and forth to each other in the early 1930s, and they quickly hit it off. Now, Robert lived in Jacksonville, Alabama, so Nanny moved pretty quickly down to Jacksonville, and they got married in 1937. At first, things seemed pretty promising. Like, all the letters were so romantic. He was sweeping her off her feet, and he just seemed like the perfect, amazing man. He was charming. He had a good job. He showered her with attention. Well, at least, like I said, on paper, he did this. It turns out that Robert was actually an alcoholic. And more than that, he was a violent alcoholic. He had a criminal record, including time served for assault. But despite these red flags, Nanny stayed in this marriage for nearly 16 years, believing she could change this man. How many women fall into that trap? Don't do that. Over time, Robert's behavior worsened. He drank heavily. He cheated on her multiple times and was allegedly physically and sexually abusive to Nanny. So she endured that for 16 years. But in 1945, after Robert had spent the night drinking to celebrate the end of World War II, he had come home crazy drunk and allegedly raped Nanny. And that was her final straw. She had had enough. She was done. So the next morning, she laced a bottle of whiskey with rat poison. The story kind of goes, he kept whiskey in the garden and she knew where it was. So she went and dug it up, dumped a little bit out, put some rat poison in it, buried it again. And then he would go out and take a drink of it, and they found his body in the garden. Well, revenge or self-defense, she may have felt like that's what she was doing, is defending herself or taking out revenge. The biggest likelihood was money, is why she killed him. Nanny often took out insurance policies on her husbands, and it's believed that she did so with Robert as well. Though there's no official payout for Robert for the insurance policy. It's widely considered to be, so this situation with Robert is considered to be Nanny's first committed murder victim, or confirmed, not committed, confirmed murder victim. But unlike the suspicious deaths during her first marriage with her children dying, this case was actually admitted by Nanny herself later when she was caught. So this is a confirmed murder. Her very first confirmed murder, I guess. And this murder signaled a transition point in Nanny's psychology. She was no longer just escaping bad marriages. She was actively removing people who inconvenienced her or disappointed her. And she began to feel powerful and in control of her life, something that would dominate all of her other relationships in the future. Which, if you think about it, this was probably the first time in her whole life where she felt like she had control over her own destiny, over her own life. So this was a new feeling for her, and I'm sure it felt amazing, and she probably was not going to give that up for anyone. Now, one of the most heartbreaking and chilling parts of Nanny's story is the murder of her own grandchildren. Now, these weren't strangers or abusive husbands. They were literally innocent children, and her actions crossed into truly monstrous territory at this point. So Nanny's daughter, the oldest daughter, Melvina, the one that the husband took away and saved from the suspected murder. Yeah, so she got married, gave birth to a baby boy in 1945, and the child only lived a few hours. Melvina remembers groggily after childbirth and after her anesthesia. She remembered seeing her mother stick a hat pin into the baby's head. When she asked family members about it later, no one could really confirm it, but there was a family member that said she saw Nanny twisting a hairpin or a hat pin in her fingers at some point near the baby. So there was no confirmation that this actually happened. Melvina just remembered seeing her mother doing something like that as she was coming out of her anesthesia. But the death was written off as unexplained and no autopsy was performed. So this was the first grandchild Nanny is believed to have murdered. And she probably did it right in front of her own daughter because she knew Melvina couldn't stop it. And you might be asking yourself, well, why? What would be the point of killing this brand new baby? Great question. We will come back to that because Nanny later murdered her grandson, Robert Franklin, Melvina's second child. Melvina had remarried and left Robert with Nanny temporarily just to watch him while she went on her honeymoon. So at this point, Nanny had already buried multiple husbands, which we're going to talk more about these other husbands. But she was well practiced in poisoning at this point. So just after Robert was left in her care, so pretty quickly after his mother had dropped him off, the 2-year-old suddenly died. Now, doctors said It was asphyxia from unknown causes, essentially a mystery. So there's been a lot of mysterious deaths surrounding this woman, and no one's questioning anything, which I find so odd. It doesn't make sense to me that no one caught on that something was happening, but Nanny later confessed that she had poisoned him by putting rat poison into the cookies she had made for the boy. So she acted like the sweet, caring grandmother who was like, I made you your special cookies. Your very own cookies. Yeah, it was because they were poisoned. And again, the question is, why would she kill her own grandchildren? And unlike her husband's, who could bring financial gain through insurance, her reasoning for killing her grandchildren was more psychologically disturbing. They think that it could have been possible that it was revenge, because Nanny and Malvina had a very strained relationship. They argued a lot, and it's possible that the killings were Nanny's way of asserting control over her daughter. Nanny really liked being in charge, and she may have killed the babies because she could. Why not? They were vulnerable. They were dependent. And she could control whether they lived or not, so why not? She also was emotionally detached. She never showed any remorse for killing her grandbabies. And when she confessed to Robert's death, she showed zero sadness at all. And these murders showed how far Nanny was willing to go. No one, not even babies, were off limits to Nanny. So now we're going to jump back into her twisted love life. She met Arlie Lanning. So like before, Nanny jumped back into those Lonely Hearts columns and met Arlie. And by the way, she met him the same year she had killed Robert, not her grandson, her husband, Robert, which, now that I think about that, they might have been killed around the same time, actually. So she met Arlie in those Lonely Hearts columns. And Arlie lived in Lexington, North Carolina, was a factory worker with a reputation for drinking and womanizing, something that I'm sure Nanny did not know, or else she would not have moved to Lexington. But she was just so desperate to find her Prince Charming. She might have been willing to overlook this, but she married him in 1952 and relocated to his small town. So on the surface, Nanny played the perfect role of the traditional Southern housewife. She was kind, she was church-going, she was affectionate, but behind closed doors, the marriage was far from stable. Arlie drank heavily, and it was very, very likely he was not faithful because he was known as a womanizer. There's no way he would just settle down for one woman. And interestingly, this was a really interesting tidbit. Nanny herself actually began to have affairs during this marriage. She would often leave town for weeks at a time, allegedly under the guise of visiting family or caring for sick relatives, which was not true. She was cheating on her spouse. So, ironically, the intense control her father had about, he didn't want her to be promiscuous and protecting her by keeping control didn't work. She turned out to sleep around anyways, so that backfired. Anyways, Arlie died suddenly, not super long after they had been married. He became violently ill and was dead within a few days. Nanny claimed it was a heart attack, and because he was a known alcoholic, obviously no one did an autopsy. You would think by now someone would spot a pattern, especially with this next tidbit of information. Nanny had poisoned him with likely arsenic or rat poison in his food. Here's where my mind is blown that no one questioned this woman, because Arlie's mother, who had also been living with them, also died under mysterious circumstances shortly after his death. A few months later, Nanny's own sister, Dovie, who was ill, and dependent upon her, died suddenly while in Nanny's care. Also, don't worry, I'm not done yet. After Arlie passed away, Nanny continued to play the grieving widow, earning the sympathy from all the neighbors and all the local church. However, even though she quickly moved into the house was left to Arlie's sister, not to Nanny. But the house mysteriously burned down, and Nanny got the insurance payout because she didn't get the house from Arlie, but because she was living there and she had been the wife, she got the insurance payout. Mysteriously caught on fire. And finally, after all of this started happening, people started whispering. There were some rumors going around. People had some suspicions, but nothing was done with it. No one did anything about it. So these weren't coincidences. Nanny was escalating, literally killing anyone who became inconvenient, a burden, or even was just simply in her way and she needed money. So this pattern continued when in 1952, Nanny married Richard Morton of Emporia, Kansas. She poisoned him when she discovered he was cheating, which is ironic because she was also cheating. It's weird that double standard takes place, but just months after Richard's death, she married Samuel Doss, a devout Nazarene minister from Oklahoma. Samuel was strict, boring, and disapproved of Nanny's romance magazines. The first man that was like, ugh, yeah, I don't like these. Well, he died not long after eating one of Nanny's home-cooked meals. So, it was Samuel's death, though, that finally triggered authorities' suspicion. An actual autopsy on him revealed amounts of arsenic large amounts of arsenic in his system. And after years of poisoning family members, husbands, her mother, sister, even grandchildren, someone finally asked some questions. Now, when Samuel died in October of 1954, the attending doctor had suspicions and was the one who actually demanded the autopsy. And when it came back positive for arsenic, the police immediately stepped in, and Nanny was arrested shortly after. When her crimes were eventually exposed, the public was horrified by this aspect above others. Poisoning husbands was one thing, but murdering her grandchildren, that made everyone see her very differently. She wasn't just a black widow, but a heartless monster. Because how do you kill your own grandkids? And I would add her own children, because I'm pretty dang sure those were her first victims. Now, what was worse, and made her look even worse, was that during questioning, Nanny giggled and smiled as she confessed to all of her murders. The police were stunned by her lack of remorse. She spoke about her crimes as if they were some recounting of this magical bad date or something. So it was just so off the cuff, like not even a big deal to her. Just like, oh yeah, I did these things. Ha 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 ha. Isn't that so funny? Ha 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 ha. That's why she got her nickname, the Giggling Granny, because she giggled through all of her confessions. Ugh, which is so creepy. Now, she ultimately confessed to 11 murders, although some suspect that the true number could be a little bit higher than that. She still was only formally charged with Samuel Doss's murder. Now, in May 1955, Nanny pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. The state declined to pursue the death penalty, mostly because of her gender, because she was a woman. And the public's fascination with her grandmotherly appearance. If you see pictures of her, she just looked like this jolly little granny. So the state refused to seek the death penalty for her. So she served 10 years in prison before dying of leukemia on June 2nd, 1965, in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She was 59 years old when she died. Now, Nanny's smile, like all of this grandmotherly appearance, was just a mask. Even when holding her grandchildren, Nanny maintained her signature sweet demeanor. She baked pies, knitted, told jokes, but quietly poisoned people. Now, a combination of poor forensic, social trust in women, and fragmented police work allowed her to kill across decades. So I think that played the part about trusting women and thinking women could never commit such horrendous crimes played a big role in this. Because when you see Nanny, she is so unassuming. She just looks like a normal granny, and she would be so sweet and kind, but she wasn't. She was a killer. So, and poor forensic. I mean, they didn't have a lot of good forensic techniques back then, but I still feel like someone should have noticed a pattern. But while I was doing my research, I actually watched an interview of Nannie Doss, or should we say the Giggling Granny? She literally came across as a sweet old woman, which made her even more terrifying because you knew what she had done. She showed absolutely no remorse, and she denied everything. She was basically like, I don't know why I'm here. I'm just a sweet old lady. Look at me. But, she's definitely guilty. So, what's the legacy of Nannie Doss? She wasn't the first female serial killer in America, by any means. She became one of the most infamous serial killers, largely because of her image, because of that sweet old granny image. The idea that someone so outwardly kind and so domestic and just come across as so sweet and caring could be capable of such horrors really shook people's assumptions. And it also revealed how little attention society paid to violence committed by women. They just did not believe women could be capable of doing what Nannie Doss did. Her nickname, the Giggling Granny, feels a little cartoonish, but that's part of what made her so terrifying. She weaponized charm and homemaking and even baked goods to hide her crimes. You know, cookies, like, Grandma, can I have a cookie? That's what killed her grandchild. And as for myths, some have painted Nanny as a misunderstood housewife driven mad by years of abuse. While she certainly experienced hardships, her calculated decisions, especially poisoning children and burning down homes and cashing in life insurance, suggest something a little bit darker. And there are plenty of people in the world that experience, abuse and hard lives that do not turn into serial killers. So there was something else in her brain that made her become a serial killer. And today she's a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a floral dress and offers you a slice of pie. So anyone is capable of doing horrible things. And this granny proved that. So thank you so much for tuning in this week for this week's episode of Horrible Humans in History. I'm, again, so sorry it took so long to get out. I'm hoping we'll be able to stay on top of things. We'll see how it goes, though. Things are crazy. I've been sick, but I want to make sure you guys are getting these because it's fun to listen to this kind of stuff. And again, make sure you're submitting suggestions. Thanks again, Stacy, for your suggestion with our Giggling Granny. This one was an interesting one. And if you have a suggestion, make sure you send it either through my Instagram account, Facebook account, or even just comment on this episode. And make sure you're liking and subscribing. Make sure you turn on that notification. So if things are going on, you'll be able to be notified once I actually do post an episode. But join us next time when we talk about King Rudolph II. He was a leader of the Holy Roman Empire from 1576 to 1612. He's probably someone you haven't heard of, which I hadn't really heard of him either, but his story is fascinating. So make sure you tune in, and I will see you guys hopefully minimum in 2 weeks. So thanks again for tuning in to Horrible Humans in History, and I will see you guys soon.